They put handcuffs on a man who was only trying to reach his sick little girl, in front of hundreds of people, in the middle of a gleaming lobby that cost more to build than most people earn in a lifetime. A billionaire pointed her finger at a quiet single father and said, "Get him out of my building." She had no idea who he was. She had no idea what he knew. And she had absolutely no idea that the moment those handcuffs clicked shut, her empire had already begun to fall. If this kind of story hits you somewhere deep, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, I bring you stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay down, and the powerful ones who never saw it coming. Drop your city and country in the comments. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And don't you dare leave before the end, because what happens in the final part? Nobody sees it coming. Not even her lawyers did. The call came at 11:47 in the morning. Rowan Mercer was 3 floors underground at the time, inside a windowless federal consulting room that smelled like old coffee and recycled air, reviewing a cybersecurity audit for a mid-sized municipal utility company that had quietly hired him after their 3rd data breach in 2 years. He had his reading glasses on, the cheap ones he'd bought at a drugstore because he kept losing the good pair, and a half-eaten granola bar sitting on the edge of the table next to a stack of manila folders he hadn't gotten through yet. His phone buzzed once, then twice. Then the ringtone cut through the quiet room, and he saw the number, Sunridge Learning Center. That was Lily's place. He picked up before the second ring finished. "Mr. Mercer?" A woman's voice. Tight, controlled, but only barely. "This is Sandra Okafor, the director at Sunridge. I need you to stay calm, okay? Lily is..." She's having a reaction. "We administered the EpiPen from her kit. We've already called 911, but the paramedic said..." Rowan was already standing. His chair scraped back loud enough to make the 2 other consultants in the room look up. "Which hospital?" he said. "Mercy General is the closest, but..." "Mr. Mercer, they're saying she may need a second dose before transport, and we want you here." "I'm coming." He was already moving toward the door, folders forgotten, granola bar forgotten, glasses still on his face. "Tell her I'm coming." He drove faster than he should have. He knew it. He didn't care. His daughter was 8 years old and weighed 53 pounds, and had a peanut allergy so severe that her pediatrician had used the phrase "minutes, not hours," twice during their last visit. He'd packed her EpiPen himself that morning. He'd checked the expiration date. He'd put it in the little purple pouch she carried in her backpack, the one with the cartoon fox on the front that she'd picked out herself. He'd done everything right, and she was still in trouble. The thing about Sunridge Learning Center was that it wasn't attached to any school. It was a private facility, a premium childcare center that had opened 3 years ago inside the lower level of Vanguard Tower, the gleaming 50-story headquarters of Vanguard Technologies, the company that belonged to Celeste Vaughn. It was one of those corporate perks that got written up in business magazines, a company-sponsored childcare solution for employees and vetted private clients. Rowan's daughter attended because of a contract arrangement he'd worked out years earlier, before he left government work, before the divorce, before everything changed. The arrangement was still active. He paid the quarterly fee. He had emergency contact status. He had building access on file. He knew this building. He had worked in this building. He pulled into the Vanguard Tower parking structure at 12:14 p.m. and jogged, not ran, because running in a parking garage in dress shoes is how you break an ankle, toward the elevator bank that connected to the main lobby. His heart was going faster than his legs. He was doing the math in his head. EpiPen administered, 911 called, paramedics en route, second dose possible. Lily would be okay. She had to be okay. She was 8 years old and she liked strawberry ice cream and was currently obsessed with a book series about a girl who solved mysteries with her pet ferret, and she was going to be fine. He stepped into the lobby at 12:17. Vanguard Tower's lobby was the kind of space that had been designed specifically to make you feel small. 40 feet of glass ceiling. White marble floors polished to a mirror finish. A waterfall feature along the east wall that cost, according to a contractor who'd worked on it and later complained to Rowan about the payment terms, somewhere north of $2 million. There were maybe 60, 70 people in the lobby at that moment. Employees with badges, visitors with lanyards, a cluster of people near the reception desk who had the particular body language of people waiting to be impressed. Rowan moved straight toward the security desk, the one closest to the childcare corridor, the same desk he'd badged through dozens of times before. "Excuse me." He put his hands flat on the desk. I need to get to the childcare center. My daughter, Lily Mercer, she's having an allergic reaction. The staff called me. The guard, young, maybe 25, with the look of someone who had been given a uniform and a rule book and not much else, held up one hand. Sir, this entrance requires executive floor pre-authorization today. We have an event. I'm not going to the executive floor. Rowan kept his voice level. I'm going to the childcare level, level B2. My daughter is there right now and she's having a medical emergency. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back and... Her name is Lily Mercer. She's 8. She's allergic to peanuts and she's had a reaction and I have emergency contact status on file. Check the system, please. The guard started to type something, slowly. Rowan watched the clock above the elevator, 12:18. He didn't shove the guard. He didn't raise his voice past what was necessary to be heard. He stood there and breathed and watched the clock and waited while the guard typed at the speed of a man who had nowhere to be and nothing urgent on his mind. He didn't see the commotion developing behind him. He was focused entirely on the guard, on the computer screen, on the number 12:18 turning to 12:19. He didn't notice when the group of people near the center of the lobby shifted. He didn't notice the woman at the edge of the group turn and look in his direction. He only noticed when he heard the voice. Who is that man, and why is he at that desk? The voice carried. It wasn't loud exactly. It didn't need to be. It had a particular quality that came from years of being the most important person in every room, a kind of compressed authority, the vocal equivalent of a hand brought down flat on a table. Rowan turned. Celeste Vaughn was 30 years old and looked like someone who had spent her entire life making sure she looked exactly like herself. She was tall, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested deliberate effortlessness. She had the kind of face that photographed well from every angle. Rowan knew this because her face had been on the cover of at least 4 business magazines in the past 2 years, 3 of which he had seen in waiting rooms without trying. She was standing in the middle of the lobby with what appeared to be a group of investors or potential partners. 6, 7 people in expensive clothes, 2 of them holding tablets, all of them now looking in Rowan's direction. He recognized the scene immediately. He'd spent enough years in security work to read a room. She was in the middle of something that mattered to her. A walkthrough. A pitch. A moment designed to demonstrate control and elegance and the smooth running of her empire. And here he was, a man in a slightly wrinkled dress shirt, reading glasses still on his face, hands on the security desk, voice elevated in a way that probably sounded to everyone in the lobby like a problem. "Ma'am," he said, because his instinct was still to be direct and calm. "I apologize for the disruption. My daughter is in your childcare center having an allergic reaction. I'm trying to get down to her." Something moved behind Celeste Vaughn's eyes. He couldn't tell, in the moment, what it was. In the months that followed, he would think back to that expression more than once, trying to identify it. The closest he could come was this. It was the expression of someone who had already made a decision before they finished hearing the sentence. "This area is closed to the public," she said. "We have a private event today." "I understand that. I'm not here for the event. I'm security." She said it without raising her voice. She didn't look at the guard. She looked at Rowan. "Remove this man." "Ma'am, please." The guard had started to move around the desk. "I have authorization to be in this building." Rowan didn't step back. He didn't advance either. He planted his feet and held his ground because he knew his rights and he knew the system and he knew that if he left this lobby, it would take him another 20 minutes to get to his daughter through any other route. "I have emergency contact status on file with your childcare center. My daughter is on level B2 right now in a medical emergency. I need you to check the system." The system is not the issue. Celeste Vaughn's voice had taken on a particular edge, the edge of someone performing certainty for an audience. She stepped forward, and the investors behind her shuffled slightly, the way people do when they're watching something unfold and trying to decide whether to pretend they aren't. "The issue is that you are in my building without invitation, making a scene, and now claiming a medical emergency as a reason to access restricted areas." "It's not a restricted area. Thomas." She addressed the head of security, a broader man who had appeared from somewhere near the elevators, not the young guard. "Call the police." Rowan went very still. He heard murmuring in the lobby. 60 people watching. Some of them had phones out. He noticed that too. The way you notice things when adrenaline sharpens everything into detail. 3, 4 people with phones raised, recording. It crossed his mind. This will be online before the police arrive. Ma'am, he kept his voice exactly level. I am asking you one more time to let someone check the childcare roster for Lily Mercer. It takes 30 seconds. My daughter is probably fine, Celeste Vaughn said. The lobby went quiet. Not completely. There was still the waterfall, still the ambient noise of a building full of people. But the people nearest them went quiet. And in that quiet, those 3 words landed hard enough that Rowan saw a few faces in the crowd react. A woman near the elevator bay who flinched slightly, a young man with a badge who looked at the floor. Is probably fine, said by a woman who didn't know his daughter's name, who hadn't checked a single screen, who was standing in front of investors she wanted to impress, and had made her calculation in about 4 seconds. Rowan didn't say anything after that. There wasn't anything to say that would change what was about to happen. He could see it clearly. She had made her choice. Thomas, the security director, was already on his radio, and the scene was going to play out regardless of what came out of his mouth next. So he did the only thing that made sense. He took out his own phone and called Sandra Okafor at the childcare center. Sandra, how is she? She's stable, Mr. Mercer. The paramedics are here. She's asking for you. Are you? I'm in the lobby. I'm having some difficulty getting down to her. Can you come up? Or have someone from medical come up and confirm my status? Of course, yes. I'll come right now. The line clicked off because Thomas had his hand on Rowan's arm. Sir, I need you to come with me. Rowan looked at the hand on his arm. He looked at Thomas. Thomas had 20 years on him and a good 4 inches, and he had the body language of a man who had done this before, and would rather not do it aggressively, but would if he had to. I'm not resisting, Rowan said clearly enough for the people with phones to hear. I want that on record. I'm not resisting. He let Thomas walk him toward the side of the lobby. His phone was still in his hand. He was still trying to think through options. How long until Sandra got up here? Whether the paramedics' arrival would change the calculus. Whether... The police arrived in 7 minutes. 2 officers. They were professional. They talked to Thomas first, then to Rowan, and then one of them looked at Celeste Vaughn, who was still in the center of the lobby with her investors, and she said, in a voice just loud enough to carry, he refused to leave after being asked multiple times. It was aggressive with the staff. The officer looked back at Rowan. Rowan thought about saying it then. All of it. The clearance, the authorization, the years of work, all of it. He thought about pulling out the documentation on his phone. He thought about a lot of things in those 3 seconds. But he also looked at the situation. A billionaire, her investors, 60 witnesses, 2 officers who had gotten a specific report, and himself. A man in a wrinkled shirt with no badge and no lanyard and no reason from the outside to be standing at a restricted security desk demanding access to a lower level. Sometimes, Rowan had learned, in 13 years of government security work, in every difficult room he had ever been in, sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let the situation finish before you respond to it. I understand, he said to the officer. I'll cooperate. The handcuffs were standard issue. They were not rough about it. But they were thorough, and they were public, and when the officer walked him toward the lobby exit, Rowan Mercer walked through 60 people's field of vision with his wrists secured behind his back. He heard the murmuring. He heard a woman say something he couldn't quite make out. He heard one of the investors near Celeste Vaughn say, quietly, but not quietly enough, "Is this a regular thing here?" And he heard Celeste Vaughn say, "Not anymore, it won't be." She was looking at him when she said it. Not at the investor. At Rowan. And there was something in her expression that he recognized from his years in government work. The satisfaction of someone who believes they have permanently removed a problem. She had no way of knowing that she was wrong. Outside, on the sidewalk in front of Vanguard Tower, while one officer spoke into his radio and the other waited for Rowan to step toward the patrol car, Rowan stood for a moment in the afternoon light and looked up at the building. 50 stories of glass and steel. Her name wasn't on it. That wasn't her style, or at least that was what the magazine profile said. They called it Understated Confidence. But the logo was there, VANGUARD in clean silver letters on the facade above the entrance. The same logo that appeared on 17 government contracts, 4 pending international agreements, and the cybersecurity framework that protected the data of approximately 43 million people. The cybersecurity framework that Rowan Mercer had designed. He got into the back of the patrol car. The door closed. The interior smelled like cleaning solution and something else he couldn't identify, and the seat was harder than it looked. He thought about Lily. Sandra had said stable, paramedics on scene. She was asking for him. He thought about the look on Celeste Vaughn's face when she said, "Not anymore." And he thought about a name, one name, a man he hadn't called in almost 2 years, a man whose direct number Rowan still had memorized because, in his line of work, some numbers you never let yourself forget. He was going to make a phone call. He just had to wait until they took the handcuffs off. At the police station, they put him in a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a paper cup of water that had gone slightly warm. The officer who processed him, Officer Daniels, according to his nameplate, a man in his mid-40s with a quiet manner and a slight limp in his left leg, went through the standard process without any particular hostility. Rowan answered every question carefully and completely. He explained who he was. He explained why he had been in the building. He mentioned, without emphasis, that he had emergency contact status with the child care center and that his authorization to access that building predated the current administration's involvement by several years. Officer Daniels wrote things down. His handwriting was small and precise. "You said you designed the building's security framework," Daniels said, not looking up from his notepad. "Part of it, the cybersecurity architecture and the emergency access protocol for the lower 3 levels. For Vanguard Technologies. Under contract. Through a federal subcontracting arrangement. The work itself was classified at the time. It's been partially declassified since." Daniels looked up then. He had a face that didn't give much away, which Rowan respected. "And you can verify this," Daniels said. "Yes." Daniels tapped his pen against the notepad once. "The report we received described you as refusing to comply with security staff and being verbally aggressive." "I raised my voice," Rowan said, "once, to ask for my daughter's status to be checked. I never touched anyone. I stated clearly when the officers arrived that I was not resisting." He paused. There were approximately 60 people in that lobby, and at least 4 of them were filming on their phones. Daniels wrote something down. "My daughter," Rowan said, "can someone—" "We already contacted the child care center when you came in." Daniels set his pen down. "She's been transported to Mercy General, stable condition. The director of the facility, Sandra Okafor, has been attempting to contact this station." Something in Rowan's chest loosened, just slightly. "Can I make a call?" he said. They gave him his phone back, not his belt and not his jacket yet, but his phone. Standard process. He was technically not under arrest, the officer explained. He was being held for processing while the complaint was reviewed. He was free to contact legal representation. He thought about calling his brother. He thought about calling the attorney he'd used during the divorce, a reasonable woman named Graves, who had told him, on more than one occasion, that he had a talent for underreacting to things that warranted strong reactions. He didn't call either of them. He scrolled to a contact that was listed under a first name only, Walter. He had known Walter Fitch for 11 years. They had worked parallel tracks in adjacent departments, Rowan in cybersecurity infrastructure, Walter in federal regulatory oversight, and had crossed paths on 3 projects over 6 years before either of them moved on. Walter was 61 now, or close to it, and he had spent the last decade building what was formerly called the Independent Systems Certification Authority, a quasi-governmental body that most people had never heard of, and that Rowan had thought about, at various points, describing to people as the organization that quietly decides whether the digital infrastructure of major corporations is allowed to exist. That was an oversimplification, but it wasn't wrong. He pressed call. Walter picked up on the second ring. "Rowan." Walter's voice was exactly as Rowan remembered it. A little raspy, a little flat, the voice of a man who spent his days reading reports and found most things mildly unsurprising. "It's been a while." "It has," Rowan said. "I'm at a police station." A pause. "All right. I need you to pull the emergency contact records for Vanguard Tower, level B2 Child Care Center, specifically the authorization protocol under the 2019 Federal Subcontracting Framework, Section 7. Another pause. Longer this time. "Section 7, Walter repeated. "Yes." Rowan. Walter's voice shifted. Not alarm exactly, but something adjacent to it, the tone of a man recalibrating. What happened? Rowan told him. All of it. The call from Sandra, the lobby, the guard, Celeste Vaughn, and her investors, the handcuffs, the walk through the crowd. He told it the way he told everything, in order, without decoration, with the relevant details in their correct positions. When he finished, Walter was quiet for a moment. She ordered security to remove you, Walter said, without checking the clearance system. Correct. And this was in front of investors. Press may have been there too. I'm not certain. And at least 4 private citizens with phones. Walter said a word that Rowan had never heard him say in 11 years of professional acquaintance. Then Walter said very carefully, I'm going to make some calls. I know, Rowan said. This is going to get complicated. I know that too. For her, Walter said. It wasn't a question. I'm not asking for anything, Rowan said. I'm just telling you what happened. What you do with it is your decision. That's very diplomatic of you, given that you're sitting in a police station in handcuff marks. I have to go see my daughter, Rowan said. Go, Walter said. I'll handle the rest. Rowan sat in the small room for another 40 minutes while the process worked itself out. Partway through that time, Officer Daniels came back in with a different expression on his face. Not dramatically different, but enough. He set a folder on the table. Mr. Mercer, he said, we've received some documentation from a federal oversight contact regarding your authorization status and your access rights to the Vanguard Tower facility. Okay, Rowan said. I'm also told, Daniels continued, in the tone of a man reading from a script he hadn't expected to be handed, that the building's internal clearance system logged an active emergency alert on your credentials at 12:19 p.m. today. That alert was not acted upon by the facility's security team. I see, Rowan said. Daniels looked at him for a moment. You're free to go, Mr. Mercer. They gave him his jacket. They gave him his belt. A young officer, the kind of young that made Rowan feel slightly ancient, drove him to Mercy General because his car was still in the Vanguard parking structure and it didn't seem practical to retrieve it first. Lily was in the pediatric observation unit on the 3rd floor. She was sitting up in the bed when he came in, wearing the paper hospital bracelet on her thin wrist, her dark hair slightly tangled, a juice box on the tray table in front of her, and a stuffed rabbit that Sandra from the childcare center had apparently retrieved from her cubby and brought along. She looked at him when he walked through the door. Daddy? She said. Not with drama, not with relief, just the word, the same way she said it any other day, like he was where he was supposed to be. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and he looked out the window at the city beyond the hospital glass, and he thought about a lobby and a woman with investors and a pair of handcuffs and a single phone call. He thought about Walter Fitch's voice saying, I'll handle the rest. He didn't know yet exactly what that would mean. He would find out soon enough. But that night, he stayed with his daughter and watched the cartoon she wanted to watch, and ate the hospital pudding cup she didn't finish, and he didn't check the news. And he didn't return the 3 calls that came in from numbers he didn't recognize, and he didn't think about Celeste Vaughn at all. Much. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic, and the grape juice Lily had spilled slightly on the tray table, and Rowan had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed sometime around midnight with his jacket pulled over his shoulders like a blanket, and his shoes still on. He slept the way he always slept when something was wrong. Not deeply, not restfully, but in that shallow layer just below consciousness, where every sound registered and his body stayed coiled even when his mind let go. Lily slept fine. She always did. Even at 8 years old, she had a capacity for sleep that Rowan had always envied slightly. The kind of sleep that came from a clear conscience and a complete absence of worry about anything beyond the immediate world. She'd eaten half a cup of pudding, watched 40 minutes of her cartoon, asked him twice if the fox in her book would survive the 3rd chapter, and then simply closed her eyes and gone under like it was nothing. He watched her breathe for a while before he let himself close his own eyes. His phone was face down on the armrest. By the time he woke up at 6:14 a.m. to the particular quality of early hospital light coming through the blinds, there were 11 missed calls and a text from his brother Danny that said, "What the hell is happening? Call me. I'm seeing something online." He didn't call Danny yet. He sat up carefully so the chair didn't creak and walked to the window and looked out at the city waking up. And he thought about Walter Fitch saying, "I'll handle the rest," and he wondered, not for the first time, exactly what that meant in practice. He found out 4 hours later. The pediatrician cleared Lily for discharge at 10:30 a.m. Observation complete, levels normal, follow up in 1 week, keep the EpiPen accessible at all times, which Rowan already knew, had always known. But he nodded at all of it because the doctor was thorough, and thorough was good. They gave Lily a sticker on the way out, a blue star, which she stuck to the back of her hand with the gravity of someone receiving a medal. Rowan drove her to his mother's house in the suburb 20 minutes east of the city. His mother, Patricia, was 64 and retired and had the particular energy of a woman who had raised 3 children largely on her own and was not impressed by very much anymore, but who opened the door when she saw Lily and immediately pulled the girl inside with a completeness that suggested the universe had returned to its correct order. "You look terrible," Patricia said to Rowan over Lily's head. "I slept in a hospital chair." "I can see that. Come inside." "I can't stay. I have—" He stopped. He didn't fully know what he had. "I have some things to deal with. Can she stay here for a day or two?" Patricia looked at him for a moment with the specific look she had been giving him since he was about 7 years old, the one that said she knew more than he was telling her and was filing it away for later. "She can stay as long as she needs to," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "Rowan." "Mom, I'm fine. I'll explain everything later." She let it go, which was its own form of kindness. He was back in the city by 12:45. He drove to his apartment, second floor of a narrow building in a neighborhood that was still deciding whether it was gentrifying or just getting older, and stood in his kitchen and made coffee that was too strong because he measured wrong, and he sat at his small table with his phone and finally started returning calls. Danny first. His brother was 40, worked in commercial real estate, and had a talent for catastrophizing that had occasionally been useful and was more often exhausting. He answered on the first ring. "Rowan, I've been trying to reach you since last night. What happened? There's a video online." "I know." "You're in handcuffs, man, in the lobby of Vanguard Tower. It's got like 200,000 views already." Rowan had looked at the video that morning, once. 43 seconds. Shaky phone footage from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. You could see him clearly. The wrinkled shirt, the reading glasses, the security guard on his arm, the officer with the handcuffs. You could see Celeste Vaughn in the background, in her charcoal blazer, her posture perfectly composed, watching. The comment section had opinions. "I'm aware," he said. "Lily is okay. She's at Mom's. I'm dealing with some things today." "What things?" "Do you need a lawyer? I don't need a lawyer, Danny." "Rowan, you were just arrested at Vanguard Tower. Celeste Vaughn. You know who she is, right? She's on the cover of like every magazine." "I know who she is." "Then you know she has resources, legal teams, PR. She could make your life very difficult." "She could try," Rowan said, and something in his voice made Danny go quiet for a second. "What does that mean?" Danny said. "It means I'm handling it. I'll call you later." He hung up and sat with his too strong coffee and looked at his phone for a moment, and then he called Walter Fitch. Walter picked up immediately, which meant he had been waiting for the call. "How's your daughter?" was the first thing Walter said. "She's good. She's at my mother's. Discharged this morning." "Good." A pause, and then Walter exhaled, a long breath through the nose that Rowan had learned to recognize over the years as the sound of a man preparing to say something complicated. "Rowan, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer directly." "Okay." "When you left your contract with the federal subcontracting program, the work you did on the Vanguard systems, were there any issues with the handover? Anything that wasn't properly documented? Anything that the company took possession of that you had questions about?" Rowan set his coffee cup down. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because," Walter said, "when my team pulled your authorization records from the Vanguard system yesterday evening, they found something irregular. Your emergency access credentials were still active, which, given your contract status and the nature of the work you did, is legally correct. But the internal alert system had been modified at some point in the past 18 months. The alert that should have flagged your credentials as authorized for emergency entry had been reclassified. Reclassified how? As inactive. Your access was live in the federal database. In Vanguard's internal system, it had been marked as terminated, which means when the clearance alert fired yesterday at 12:19, and it did fire, we have the log, the security team would have seen it and been able to consciously choose to either investigate or ignore it. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Someone changed my status in their system. That's one interpretation. And the other interpretation is that it was an administrative error. Walter didn't say it with any particular conviction. We're looking into which of those is accurate, but either way, Rowan, and this is the part I need you to listen to carefully, the investigation that started yesterday is not just about your authorization status anymore. What do you mean? I mean, Walter said carefully, that when my team went into the Vanguard systems with the federal access we're entitled to use under our oversight mandate, what they found in the first 12 hours of review was not limited to questions about your credentials. A beat. Walter, I can't give you details right now. It's an active investigation, and that wouldn't be appropriate. But I will tell you this. You should expect that things are going to move very quickly in the next few days. And I would suggest that you stay quiet, stay available if we need to talk to you, and let this process work. How bad is it? Rowan said. What they found. Another long exhale. I've been doing this for 23 years, Walter said. And I can count on one hand the number of times I've come into work on a Tuesday and genuinely not known what the week was going to look like by Friday. He paused. This is one of those times. They hung up, and Rowan sat in his kitchen for a long time without moving. The investigation that Walter's organization had launched moved the way federal investigations move when the people running them have both the authority and the evidence to go fast, quietly, thoroughly, and faster than anyone on the outside expected. Rowan didn't see most of it happen. It was not an investigator in this. He was a witness, a source, a name, attached to a set of credentials that had opened a door nobody at Vanguard Technologies had expected to be opened. But he heard things. Walter called him 3 times over the next 72 hours. Brief calls, carefully worded, each one a small amount more specific than the last. The first call came the morning after their initial conversation. Walter said, "The surveillance footage from yesterday has been reviewed. The internal alert your credentials generated was seen by at least 2 people before the police were called. One of them was the head of security. The footage shows him looking at the monitor, looking at the lobby, and making a deliberate decision not to act on it." The second call came the following afternoon. Walter said, "We pulled the financial audit records from the last 3 fiscal years as part of our systems review. There are discrepancies, significant ones. We've brought in a secondary team." The third call came 2 days after that, early in the morning, before Rowan had finished his first cup of coffee. Walter's voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Not quite alarm, not quite excitement, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. "The cybersecurity architecture you built for Vanguard," Walter said. "The original documentation, the design files, the development records, the patent-adjacent licensing framework you built under the federal subcontracting arrangement." "Yes," Rowan said. "Vanguard filed 3 separate proprietary claims on components of that system in 2021 and 2022. Corporate filings. They listed the original developer as an internal engineering team." Rowan was quiet. "Rowan," Walter said, "was there ever any agreement, any documentation, transferring ownership of those components to Vanguard Technologies?" "The contract was for implementation and integration," Rowan said. "The underlying architecture remained with the federal program. That was standard. That was in writing. That's what our records show too." Walter paused. "Their filings say something different." There was nothing to say to that for a moment. "How many of those systems are active right now?" Rowan finally asked. "All 3. They're in use across 17 government contracts and 4 pending international agreements." Walter stopped. "That's what's driving the pace here, Rowan. This isn't just a corporate fraud situation anymore. There are national security implications, active systems with disputed ownership and unverified security integrity." "Which is what happens," Rowan said, "when you claim you built something you didn't build. You don't actually know how it works." "No," Walter said. "You don't." The investigation expanded. Rowan found this out not from Walter but from the news, because by the 4th day after the lobby incident, it wasn't possible to keep it contained anymore. The first story broke on a mid-tier financial news site, a short item about a federal oversight review of Vanguard Technologies' cybersecurity compliance. By that evening, it had been picked up by 3 larger outlets. By the following morning, it was on the front page of two major national newspapers. None of the early coverage mentioned Rowan's name. None of it mentioned the lobby incident, the handcuffs, the video that was still circulating online with a steadily increasing view count. The financial press was interested in the investigation itself, the systemic implications, the contract suspensions, the market reaction. And the market reacted. Rowan followed it the way he followed most things he didn't have direct control over, at a slight distance, with the particular detachment of someone who has been in enough situations to know that watching the details doesn't change them. He checked the stock ticker twice a day, not obsessively. He read the news stories once each, not multiple times. He noticed when Vanguard's stock dropped 11% in a single session on the third day of coverage, and he noted it the way a doctor might note a patient's blood pressure, as information, not as satisfaction. That wasn't entirely true. He's not a saint about it, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. When he saw the 11% drop, he did in fact sit back in his chair and exhale in a way that wasn't purely clinical. He thought about Celeste Vaughn's face when she said, "is probably fine." He thought about 60 people in a lobby and a pair of handcuffs. And then he went to pick up Lily from his mother's house and didn't think about it for the rest of the evening. But the investigation was not abstract, and it was not quiet, and it was not contained to stock prices and news items. The people inside Vanguard Technologies were living it in real time, and what was happening inside that building over those first 72 hours was considerably more chaotic than anything the financial press captured. Rowan learned the details later, in pieces, from sources he had not expected. The first call came from a woman named Iris Chen, who had been Vanguard's chief systems engineer for 4 years before resigning 6 months prior. Rowan had never met her, but she had his number from a mutual contact in the federal subcontracting world, and she called him on a Thursday evening while he was helping Lily with a reading worksheet. "I know you don't know me," she said. "My name is Iris. I worked at Vanguard until February. I left because—" She stopped, started again. "I left because I was being asked to sign documentation that I knew was inaccurate. Development attribution records. For systems that I personally knew had been developed externally." Rowan set down the pencil he'd been using to check Lily's answers. "Go on." "I didn't know your name then. I found it out 2 days ago, when this whole thing started. I want you to know that there are people inside that building, people who are still there, who have been waiting for this, who couldn't say anything because they were afraid, and now that there's a federal review, they're starting to talk." "Are you talking to the investigators?" Rowan asked. "My lawyer is in contact with them, yes. I have documentation, files I kept. I shouldn't have taken them out of the building, but I did because I had a feeling that someday—" She stopped again. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this. I think I just needed to tell someone who wasn't a lawyer." "It's okay," Rowan said. "Does it feel okay?" Her voice had a question in it that was separate from the words. From the outside, "Does this feel like justice, or does it feel like just mess?" He thought about that for a moment. Lily had looked up from her worksheet and was watching him with the alert curiosity of a child monitoring a situation she's been trained not to interrupt. "It feels like something that needed to happen," Rowan said. "I don't have a cleaner answer than that." Iris Chen gave her testimony to the investigators the following day. She was not the only one. Over the course of the next week, 4 former Vanguard executives made contact with the federal oversight team. A former VP of operations named Gerald Haas, who had been with the company for 9 years and had left under what official company statements called mutual agreement and what his attorney called something considerably different. A financial controller named Monica Webb, who had been put on administrative leave 8 months earlier and had subsequently spent those months organizing a very careful set of documents. 2 senior engineers who had signed non-disclosure agreements that their attorneys were now arguing were unenforceable in the context of an active federal investigation. The non-disclosure argument was still being litigated when investigators executed a series of document warrants on Vanguard's corporate offices. Rowan heard about the warrants from Walter, who called him at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday with the flat, precise tone of a man reading from a mental checklist. Document warrants executed this morning, accounting records, executive communications, IP ownership filings, internal audit reports from the past 5 years. A pause. Also the surveillance archive. All of it. including the full footage from the day you were in the lobby. All right, Rowan said. The company's legal team is contesting the scope. It won't hold. Another pause. Also, Rowan, the 3 government contracts that involve your architecture have been suspended pending security review. 17 additional contracts are under evaluation. Rowan was standing in his kitchen again. He had been making eggs. The pan was starting to smoke. He turned the burner off. How is she handling it? He said. He didn't need to say who. Walter was quiet for a moment. She released a statement yesterday evening, called it a targeted regulatory attack, said the company has full confidence in its compliance record. That's one way to describe it. It's the only way she has right now, Walter said. The alternative is acknowledging the documentation her own executives have been providing to us, which he stopped. I'll just say the documentation is extensive. What the documentation showed, and this came out in pieces over the following days, as investigators processed the material and reporters with sources inside the process began publishing carefully worded accounts, was not entirely surprising to anyone who had worked in Rowan's world and understood how certain kinds of corporate fraud accumulated over time. It wasn't a single spectacular crime. It was layers. It was years of small decisions compounding into something that, when viewed all at once, was considerably larger than any individual piece had suggested. The false IP attribution filings were the cleanest thread, the most documentable, the most directly connected to federal law, the most straightforwardly provable. Vanguard had filed proprietary claims on cybersecurity architecture components that belonged, by the explicit terms of a federal subcontracting agreement, to the government program that had commissioned them. Those filings had allowed the company to present those systems as proprietary assets, which had in turn supported valuations, attracted investment, and secured contracts. The financial manipulation was more complicated. 3 fiscal years of reporting that, under examination by a forensic accounting team brought in as part of the oversight review, revealed a pattern of revenue recognition practices that an investigator described in a document Rowan was later allowed to see as structurally designed to obscure the actual financial position of the company from shareholders. The executive surveillance was the piece that surprised him most. Not because executive surveillance was unusual. He had spent enough time in corporate security to know it was more common than most people realized, but because of the scope. Internal communication systems that had been secretly monitored, employee devices, a former executive's personal email account, accessed without authorization. The forensic trail was specific and extensive and pointed in a single direction. None of this had been visible from the outside. From the outside, Vanguard Technologies had been a success story, a 30-year-old woman who had built an empire through vision and tenacity, whose name appeared on magazine covers and in Forbes rankings and in glowing profiles that used words like disruptive and visionary and transformative. The building had looked solid from the outside, but Rowan had spent his career understanding that the outside of buildings was the least reliable information you had. 3 weeks after the lobby incident, on a Thursday morning when the weather had turned and the city was gray and cool and the leaves in the park near Rowan's apartment were starting to turn, he received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't pick up. He'd been fielding calls from journalists for days, respectful calls, most of them, because the story had shifted in the public conversation from a 30-second video of a man being handcuffed to something considerably more complex, and he'd gotten into the habit of letting unknowns go to voicemail. He picked this one up because something made him. He couldn't explain why. Mr. Mercer. A man's voice. Formal. Measured. My name is Arthur Geary. I'm an attorney representing several of the institutional shareholders of Vanguard Technologies. A pause. I've been authorized to inform you that the board of directors has called an emergency session for next Thursday. The agenda has been provided to the oversight authority, as required by the investigation protocol. Another pause. I'm contacting you because your name is likely to come up during these proceedings in the context of the IP attribution questions, and we felt it was appropriate to give you advance notice. I appreciate that, Rowan said. There's also... Geary hesitated, just briefly, but it was there. There's also the question of how the company will characterize the events of the day in question, the lobby incident. Several board members have expressed that they want the record to be accurate. What does that mean? It means, Geary said carefully, That there are people on that board who watched the video and then watched the investigation unfold and arrived at a conclusion about what happened that day and what it says about the leadership of this company. Rowan looked out his window at the gray sky and the turning leaves. A kid was walking a very large dog on the sidewalk below, being pulled more than walking, struggling and laughing at the same time. "Mr. Geary," he said, "I don't have any particular interest in the board's proceedings beyond what the investigators need from me. I'm not a complainant. I'm a witness." "I understand that," Geary said. "I just want you to know that what happened to you that day, how it's being understood now, in context, it matters to the people who are going to be in that room next Thursday." After he hung up, Rowan sat for a while and did nothing in particular. He thought about the last time he had been inside Vanguard Tower, the years before Celeste Vaughn had taken control of it, the months he'd spent working on the systems in the lower levels while the building was still being finished around him, eating sandwiches from a vending machine on level B3 and calling his then-wife to say he'd be late again. He thought about building something well, about the specific satisfaction of work that functioned exactly the way you designed it to function. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Lily wants to know if you're coming for dinner. She says she found something important in Chapter 4. He smiled at his phone. It was a small smile, a private one, the kind that doesn't need anyone else to witness it. He texted back. "Tell her I'll be there by 6. Don't let her tell me what it is. I want to hear it from her." His mother sent back a thumbs up and then, after a moment, a second text. "I saw something on the news this morning about that company." "I know," he texted back. "Are you all right?" He thought about that for a moment, thought about the lobby and the handcuffs and Lily in the hospital bed with the juice box, and Walter's voice saying, "I'll handle the rest," and 11% in a single session, and the attorney who had called to tell him the board was convening, and the woman named Iris Chen who had needed to tell someone who wasn't a lawyer. "Yeah," he texted. "I'm all right." He put his phone in his pocket and went to get his jacket, because if he was going to his mother's for dinner by 6, he needed to leave in the next hour, and he still needed to find the parking receipt for the Vanguard Tower garage so he could get his car out of Hawk. He had not been back to the building since the day they'd walked him out in handcuffs. He suspected that was going to change before this was over. But not tonight. Tonight was dinner and Chapter 4, and whatever Lily had found important in a mystery novel about a girl and her ferret, and that was, for the moment, enough. The board meeting was still 6 days away when Celeste Vaughn decided she was done being on the defensive. Rowan found out about her counteroffensive the same way most people found out about things they weren't supposed to know were coming, from someone who felt bad about it afterward. A journalist named Paul Whitaker, who covered the technology sector for a national publication and had been one of the reporters trying to reach Rowan for the past 2 weeks, called him on a Friday afternoon and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know I'm not calling for a story. I'm calling because what I'm about to tell you is going to affect you, and I think you deserve to know first." Rowan was in the parking lot of a grocery store. He'd been about to get out of the car. He stayed in it. "Go ahead," he said. "Vanguard's PR team has been briefing select outlets for the past 48 hours. Off the record, for now, but the intent is clear. They're building a narrative." Whitaker paused. "The narrative is about you." "What about me?" "That the federal investigation is being driven by a disgruntled former contractor with a personal grievance. That you used your daughter's medical situation as a pretext to access restricted areas. That the authorization you claim to have had was expired, and you knew it. That your contact at the Oversight Authority—" He stopped. "They're going to name Rowan. They're going to say the investigation is compromised by a personal relationship." Rowan stared through the windshield at the grocery store entrance. A woman was pushing a cart with a toddler in the seat, and the toddler was holding a banana that was clearly not purchased yet, and the woman hadn't noticed. "When does this go public?" he said. "If I had to guess, they're waiting for the right moment. Something to disrupt the news cycle around the investigation. The board meeting is Thursday, so probably before that." Whitaker's voice had the careful quality of someone walking a line. "I'm not the only journalist they've briefed. I'm probably the only one calling you." "Why are you calling me?" A pause. "Because I watched that video 40 times when it first came out," Whitaker said. "And I have a daughter. She's 12. And I kept thinking—" He stopped himself. "That's not relevant. The point is, you need to know this is coming." "I appreciate it," Rowan said. "Is any of it true?" The expired authorization, the personal grievance? No, Rowan said simply. Okay. A beat. For what it's worth, I believe you, but belief doesn't stop a coordinated media campaign. They hung up and Rowan sat in his car for another 5 minutes without going into the store. He thought about Celeste Vaughn in her charcoal blazer, the particular quality of her certainty in that lobby, the way she had looked at him when she said not anymore. He thought about the fact that she was still fighting, still maneuvering, still operating from the assumption that the right combination of pressure and narrative could reshape reality into something more convenient. He thought about what that said about her. And then, because he was honest with himself, even when it was uncomfortable, he thought about what it said about him, that part of him, a small, tired, human part, had hoped she would just stop. She wasn't going to stop. He got out of the car and went and bought the groceries. The campaign launched publicly on a Sunday evening, which was, from a media strategy standpoint, a choice. Sunday evening drops hit the Monday morning news cycle, when people are returning to work and paying attention, and they give the weekend shows something to close on. Rowan was watching a nature documentary with Lily. She'd come home Saturday and had been firmly attached to the couch ever since, when his phone started going again. The first major piece appeared on the website of a financial commentary platform that had a reputation for well-sourced but aggressively framed analysis. The headline was careful enough to avoid anything directly actionable, but the framing was exactly what Whitaker had described. Questions emerge about federal investigations' impartiality. The piece cited anonymous sources inside Vanguard who described Rowan as a former contractor who had departed under tense circumstances and who had maintained a long-standing personal relationship with the oversight authority's leadership. It described the lobby incident as a security dispute that had been escalated beyond its scope. It mentioned Walter Fitch by name, twice. Two similar pieces appeared on other platforms within the hour. Not identical, clearly from different briefings, different journalists, but aligned in their central argument. Something wasn't right about how this investigation had started, and the man at the center of it had reasons of his own for wanting to damage Vanguard Technologies. Lily was asleep by the time Rowan finished reading all three pieces. He sat at his kitchen table with the laptop open and a glass of water he wasn't drinking, and he read them again, more slowly, looking for the specific claims that would need to be addressed and the ones that were simply atmospheric, the tone-setting language designed not to prove anything, but to make a reader feel uncertain. There was a lot of atmospheric language. His phone rang. Walter. "I've seen it," Rowan said before Walter could speak. "I'm going to need to make a statement tomorrow," Walter said. His voice had a quality Rowan hadn't heard in it before. Controlled anger. Not rage. Walter Fitch didn't do rage. It wasn't in his register. But something compressed and deliberate, like a door being held firmly shut. The implication that this investigation is driven by a personal relationship is, he stopped. It's not only false, it's an obstruction tactic, and my legal team is reviewing whether it crosses into territory that creates additional exposure for the company. Meaning they may have just made things worse for themselves. Potentially, yes. A pause. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Rowan said. He meant it about 70%. "Your name is going to be in a lot of places in the next few days, Rowan. I want to make sure you're prepared for that. I've been in difficult situations before." "Not like this," Walter said, not unkindly. "Not publicly. Your world was always, you worked in rooms that didn't have windows. This is different." It was different. Rowan knew it was different. The next morning he found out exactly how different when he went to take Lily to school and a man with a camera was standing on the sidewalk in front of his building. Not aggressive, not shouting, just standing there with a long lens. And when Rowan came out with Lily, her backpack on, her purple EpiPen pouch clipped to it, the cartoon fox staring out at the world, the man raised the camera. Rowan put his hand up, not toward the camera, but toward Lily, a gentle redirect, steering her toward the car without making it sudden. "Keep walking, Bug," he said quietly. "Don't look over there." "Who is that?" she said, looking immediately. "Someone with a camera." "Why do they want to take our picture?" "Something I was involved with at work. It's not a big deal." She processed this with the particular pragmatism of an 8-year-old who had been raised by a man who did not dramatize things. "Okay," she said, and got in the car. He drove her to school, walked her to the door, and stood outside for a moment after she went in with the specific feeling of a man who has been in many difficult situations and has generally been able to manage them, but is now confronting the particular vulnerability of having someone small and important who can be photographed by a stranger on a public sidewalk. He didn't like it. He didn't like it in a way that went past inconvenience into something older and more territorial. He called his attorney that morning. Not the divorce attorney, a different one, a man named Stuart Elroy, who had done some contract work in Rowan's professional life and understood the intersection of federal contracting and corporate law better than most people who weren't working in it. Elroy was 57 and had the energy of someone permanently running slightly late, and he picked up with his coat still rustling like he'd just walked into his office. "I've been waiting for this call," Elroy said. "I read the pieces this morning. I want to know what my options are," Rowan said. "Legally? Several. The most interesting one is the defamation angle. The claim that you departed your contract under tense circumstances is false and provably false. We have the documentation. The suggestion that your authorization was expired and you knew it is contradicted by federal records." Elroy clicked something on his end. "The trickier piece is the Walter Fitch angle because it's framed as a question rather than a statement. Questions emerge. Sources close to the company suggest. It's designed to be slippery. Can we go after the sources? We can try. Discovery in a defamation case would potentially expose whoever provided the briefing." A pause. "But Rowan, and I want to be direct with you here, litigation takes time, and what I think you actually want is for this to resolve in the next 2 weeks before the board meeting and whatever comes after. A lawsuit filed today doesn't help you in that window. So what does? The truth, delivered clearly and in a format people can understand." Elroy's voice shifted slightly. "You've been quiet publicly. I understand why. You don't like attention. You're protecting your daughter. You don't want to feed the cycle. But there's a difference between being quiet and being invisible, and right now they're trying to make the story about you in your absence, which means you're being defined by people who want to define you a certain way." Rowan thought about this. "I don't want to do media." "I know you don't. I especially don't want Lily involved." "I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting—" Elroy paused. "There's a journalist, Paul Whitaker. He covers tech for—" "I know who he is," Rowan said. "He called you?" "Friday." A brief silence. "And you didn't call me about it until today." "I needed to think." Elroy exhaled. "Rowan, I appreciate that you're a thoughtful person. I genuinely do. But in the current environment, thinking for 3 days is the same as handing them 3 days." He called Whitaker that afternoon. The journalist picked up on the first ring. He didn't sound surprised. "I wondered when you'd call," Whitaker said. "I want to talk," Rowan said, "but not in the way you're probably hoping. I'm not giving an interview. I'm not going on record with anything beyond what's already in the federal documentation." "Okay," Whitaker said carefully. "What I'm willing to do is give you access to the contract records. The original federal subcontracting agreement, the authorization protocol, the development documentation that shows the origin of the systems in question. All of it is going to come out in the investigation anyway. But if you have it first and can verify it independently, then when the investigation findings are made public, there's already a verified record in the journalism space that matches them." Whitaker was quiet for a moment. "You're not trying to tell your side of the story." "I'm trying to make sure the documents tell the actual story," Rowan said. "There's a difference. Most people in your position want to control the narrative. I can't control the narrative. The documents are what they are." He paused. "The only thing I can control is whether the right documents are in the right hands before someone tries to bury them." Whitaker met him at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Rowan's apartment on a Wednesday morning. Rowan brought a folder, printed copies, not originals, with a digital package separately secured, and sat across from a man who turned out to be younger than his voice had suggested, maybe 35, with the slightly rumpled look of someone who had been covering a breaking story for 3 weeks without adequate sleep. They sat for 2 hours. Rowan walked him through the documents without editorializing, explaining the structure of the federal subcontracting agreement, what the authorization protocol meant in practice, what development attribution meant in the context of IP ownership, and what the difference was between the records Vanguard had filed publicly and what the original documentation said. Whitaker asked good questions. He also, at one point, put his pen down and said, "Off the record, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "When you were in that lobby, when she ordered security to remove you, what were you thinking?" Rowan looked at his coffee. "I was thinking about my daughter," he said. "That's it. That's the whole answer." Whitaker picked his pen back up. He wrote something down and then looked at it and crossed it out, which Rowan found, for some reason, reassuring. The piece Whitaker published 2 days later was the longest thing he'd written in his career. Rowan read it in one sitting at his kitchen table on a Friday morning before Lily was awake. It was thorough and careful and built its argument the way good journalism does, from specific documented evidence outward, not from conclusion backward. It laid out the original contract framework. It laid out the IP attribution filings Vanguard had made. It compared them, side by side, with the federal documentation. It quoted the relevant legal language without simplifying it into something inaccurate. And at the end, in the final 3 paragraphs, it addressed the campaign Vanguard's PR team had launched, not with counterattacks, but with documents. The authorization records. The timeline. The specific federal log entry showing that Rowan's credentials had generated an active emergency alert at 12:19 p.m. on the day of the lobby incident, and the internal Vanguard surveillance record showing the security director looking at the alert and choosing not to act. It did not quote Rowan by name in the body of the piece. He had asked for that, and Whitaker had honored it. Rowan set his laptop aside and made breakfast and woke Lily up for school and spent a morning that looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. But the piece had landed. He knew it the way you know certain things, not from data, but from the particular quality of the silence before a reaction arrives. The reaction came by afternoon. The Vanguard legal team released a response that was, in the words of a legal analyst quoted on a financial news program Rowan half-watched while making dinner, notably aggressive in tone and notably thin in substance. It challenged the sourcing. It questioned the documentation's chain of custody. It described the piece as coordinated with federal investigators, an accusation that Whitaker immediately and publicly denied with the specific heat of a journalist whose integrity had been questioned. By the following morning, 3 of the journalists who had published the Sunday pieces, the ones that had started the campaign against Rowan, had reached out to their editors asking to revisit what they'd written. 2 of those editors, Rowan heard later from Whitaker, had received calls from Vanguard's PR team and had discovered, in the course of those conversations, that they had been given information that was not entirely accurate. One of those editors published a correction. It was a small correction, technically. 3 sentences. But in the architecture of a media campaign, a correction in an outlet that had been part of your initial push is a crack in a foundation. Rowan had seen enough of these situations to know that cracks propagated. Inside Vanguard Tower, the situation was deteriorating in ways that the official communications still weren't acknowledging publicly. Rowan didn't have direct visibility into the building, but he had Iris Chen, who had stayed in sporadic contact since her initial call, and who texted him on a Thursday with a message that was 5 words long. "People are starting to talk." He called her back. "What does that mean specifically?" he said. "It means that the warrant scared people," Iris said. She sounded tired. The particular tired of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and could see the end of it but not quite reach it yet. When investigators actually walk into a building and take physical document boxes, it changes the atmosphere. It stops being abstract. People who had been staying quiet because they thought it would blow over are realizing it's not going to blow over. Who specifically? I can't give you names, but I can tell you that Gerald Haas isn't the only former executive who's talking. There are people who are still there, still inside the company, who have been approached by their own attorneys and advised to cooperate. A pause. The overseas accounts, Rowan. That's the part that's moving fast. There are accounts in 3 separate jurisdictions that the investigators found through the financial records, and those jurisdictions are cooperating with the federal request. The freezing orders are being processed. Rowan sat with this for a moment. How much? I don't know the exact figures, but enough that when it becomes public, the valuation questions are going to look very different. He thanked her and let her go, and he stood in his kitchen and thought about a woman who had built an empire and had made, at some point along the way, a series of decisions that she must have believed were manageable. He thought about that because it mattered to understand it. Not to excuse it, but to understand how these things happened. How someone got from building a company to filing false IP claims to freezing assets overseas to standing in a lobby in front of investors and publicly humiliating a man who was trying to reach his sick child. It didn't happen in one day. It never did. It happened the way all compound problems happened, one small decision at a time, each one made easier by the last one, until the distance between where you started and where you were had become so large that you couldn't afford to look back at it honestly. The board meeting was now 4 days away. Celeste Vaughn, for her part, was not done. Rowan had to give her that. Whatever her flaws, and the list was becoming increasingly documented, she did not give up. On the Monday before the Thursday board meeting, her legal team filed 3 separate motions, one challenging the scope of the document warrants, one requesting a formal review of Walter Fitch's role in initiating the investigation, and one that, in its most aggressive section, sought to subpoena Rowan's own records, his federal contract files, his communications with Walter Fitch, his financial records for the past 5 years. The subpoena motion was the one that made Rowan's attorney call him at 8 a.m. "It's not going to succeed," Elroy said, without greeting. "I want you to know that up front. The legal basis is thin, and the judge assigned to this, I know her background. She's not going to look kindly on what is clearly an intimidation tactic dressed up as discovery. But it's going to take time." "Some. Yes, that's the point. They're trying to slow the momentum before Thursday." A pause. "There's also the practical, which is that your records are going to be completely clean, and this is going to look, in retrospect, like a company trying to deflect by attacking a witness." "Fine," Rowan said. "You're not upset?" "I'm annoyed," Rowan said. "There's a difference." Elroy was quiet for a second. "You're a very calm person, Rowan. I've had clients facing a fraction of this who needed sedation." "I have a kid to feed breakfast," Rowan said. "I can't afford to be anything else." The subpoena motion was denied on a Tuesday. The scope challenge on the document warrants was partially upheld, a narrow ruling that excluded some personal communications but left the core financial and IP documentation fully accessible. The Fitch review request was denied outright, with a ruling that included language describing the request as procedurally unfounded. Rowan read the rulings in a summarized form sent to him by Elroy with 3 words appended, 3 for 3. On the same Tuesday that the rulings came down, 2 things happened that Rowan found out about in the wrong order. The first was that 3 senior Vanguard executives who were still employed at the company, not former employees, not people who had left, but people with active titles and active access, and each of those attorneys had made contact with federal investigators to discuss cooperation. The second was that one of those executives had, as part of an initial conversation with investigators, mentioned the existence of a set of internal memos that had not been captured in the original document warrant, memos stored on a private server that had not been part of the initial disclosure. Rowan found out about the executives first, from Iris. He found out about the memos second, from Walter, who called him at 6:30 in the evening while he was sitting on the floor of Lily's room, helping her build something complicated from a craft kit that had 37 pieces and instructions written by someone who clearly did not have children. "We have a new production order going in tomorrow morning," Walter said. "There are additional documents we weren't aware of." "I heard something about a private server," Rowan said. Walter was quiet for a moment. "You have good sources." "I have one source. She's careful and she's credible." "The documents on that server—" Walter stopped, started again. "I'm going to be careful about what I say here because this is an active matter, but I will say that if what we've been told about their content is accurate, it changes the evidentiary picture significantly." "How significantly?" "Rowan." Walter's voice was measured, but underneath the measurement there was something else. Something that sounded, in a man Rowan had never known to be surprised by much, a lot like gravity. "There are internal communications referencing the architecture work by name, referencing the federal origin of the systems, referencing a decision, a documented, discussed, recorded decision, about how to file the IP claims." Rowan set down the piece of the craft project he was holding. "They knew," he said. "Not a question." "If the documents are what we've been told they are," Walter said carefully, "then yes. The decision to file those claims in the way they were filed was not an oversight. It was a choice, and it was discussed internally, in writing, in communications that were then stored on a server that was not part of the company's standard disclosure process. Lily had appeared at his elbow at some point during the call. She was holding two pieces of the craft kit and looking at him with the patient expression of someone waiting for adult business to conclude. "I have to go," Rowan said. "Are we still on for Thursday?" "We're still on for Thursday," Walter said. "Rowan, I know I keep saying this, but let the process work." "I'm letting it work," Rowan said. "I've been letting it work this whole time." After he hung up, he sat cross-legged on the floor and took the two pieces Lily was holding and tried to figure out where they went. And Lily sat beside him with the instructions and read them out loud with the careful diction of someone taking a very serious job seriously, and he followed her directions. And it took another 40 minutes and 3 wrong assemblies before the thing finally came together into what was apparently supposed to be a small decorative birdhouse painted in colors that Lily described as sunset and also a little bit of brown. He held it up and looked at it. "It's good," he said. "It's a little crooked," she said. "Crooked things can still be good." She considered this with the philosophical seriousness that she applied to most things. "Okay," she said finally, "but next time I want to do the one with the butterfly. That one has fewer pieces." He put her to bed at 8:30 and stood in the hallway outside her room afterward, in the particular quiet of a house where a child is sleeping, and he thought about Thursday. 4 days ago, the campaign against him had been at full momentum. The media pieces, the legal motions, the subpoenas, the anonymous briefings. Celeste Vaughn had deployed every resource available to her, had fought with everything she had tried to reshape the story through force of will and institutional leverage. And now 3 of her own executives were cooperating with investigators. The overseas accounts were frozen. The IP documentation was in the hands of a journalist who had published it with full sourcing. A private server with memos that apparently documented the decision, the conscious, discussed, recorded decision, to file false IP claims was being processed under a new production order. She had fought hard. She had fought smart, in the ways she knew how to fight, and every punch she threw had landed on the same wall. The wall was not Rowan. He wanted to be clear about that, at least in his own head. He had not built a wall against her. He had not strategized or counterattacked or played a long game of careful moves. He had made one phone call to a man he trusted, and then he had told the truth to people who asked for it, and then he had gone home and helped his daughter build a slightly crooked birdhouse. The wall was just the truth. It had been sitting there the whole time. She had been throwing things at it for years, and then she had thrown one thing too many, and now it wasn't bending anymore. Thursday was 4 days away. He turned off the hallway light and went to make himself a cup of tea he probably wouldn't finish, and somewhere across the city, in a glass tower that still had his name in the architecture of its most critical systems, a 30-year-old woman who had believed she was untouchable was spending her night in conversation with lawyers who were beginning, very carefully, to explain to her the difference between a problem you can fight your way out of and one you can't. Thursday came the way consequential days usually do, without ceremony, without any particular signal that this one was different from the ones before it. Rowan woke at 5:40 because that was when he always woke, made coffee that was slightly better measured than usual, and sat at his kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn light while the city outside his window did the slow business of starting up again. Lily was at his mother's. He'd dropped her the night before, and Patricia had taken one look at his face and not asked any questions, which was the specific kindness he needed from her. Lily had asked if he was coming back for breakfast, and he'd said probably not, and she'd accepted this with the equanimity of a child who had learned that her father sometimes had things that required his full attention, and that he always came back. He had ironed his shirt the night before. Not because anyone had asked him to, not because he was appearing anywhere publicly. He wasn't. He had been very clear with Elroy and with Walter that he would not be inside that board meeting, would not be in the building at all if it could be helped. He ironed it because doing something careful and ordinary with his hands had helped him sleep, and because the shirt was wrinkled and wrinkled things bothered him on days when he already had enough to think about. Walter called at 7. "How are you feeling?" Walter said. "I'm fine," Rowan said, which was what he always said and which Walter had long since learned to translate as "I'm managing." The meeting starts at 9. Full board, all 14 members. The investigative team will be presenting findings as part of the agenda that's been formally arranged with legal authorization. 3 sets of attorneys will be present: the company's outside counsel, the board's independent counsel, and our team. A pause. "The major institutional shareholders have all sent representatives. This is not a routine session." "I know." There's going to be press outside the building, significant press. The meeting itself is closed, but the fact of it has been reported, and people are waiting. I'm not going down there, Rowan said. I know you're not. I'm telling you so you have the full picture. Walter paused again. Rowan, whatever happens today, and I believe I know what's going to happen, I want you to know that you handled this correctly. You called me. You told the truth. You stayed out of the way of the process. That's harder than it sounds. It's not that hard, Rowan said. You'd be surprised how many people can't do it. They hung up, and Rowan refilled his coffee and sat back down. And he thought about 14 board members in a room, and evidence, and what it looked like when a thing finally reached the point where it couldn't be argued around anymore. The Vanguard Technologies Board of Directors met in a 53rd floor conference room that was separate from the executive suite, large enough for the full board, with a long table of pale wood that had always struck the people who worked in the building as slightly too formal for the company's stated culture of innovation and accessibility. There were photographs on one wall, milestones, launch events, the ribbon cutting when the building opened. In most of them, Celeste Vaughn was at the center. She arrived at 8:52 a.m. She came through the executive elevator with two members of her legal team and her chief of staff, a young woman named Dana, who had been with her for 3 years and who that morning had the particular posture of someone performing calm that they did not feel. Celeste herself was dressed in a dark navy suit that Rowan would later hear described by someone who had been in the room as the kind of outfit you wear when you want to project control and haven't slept in 2 days. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was composed with the deliberateness of someone who had practiced composure so long it had become a kind of armor. She did not look like a woman who believed she was beaten. That was the thing about her, the thing that the people in that room would remember long after everything else had faded. She did not walk in defeated. She walked in the way she had always walked into every room. Like she was the most important person in it, like she had made decisions that needed to be made, like whatever was about to happen was going to happen on terms she had some control over. The 14 board members were already seated. Most of them she had known for years, had cultivated in some cases, had worked alongside in the early years when the company was smaller and the dynamics were more transparent. 3 of them she had appointed herself. 4 others had been in place when she took control of the company and had remained through a combination of genuine respect for her early work, and more recently, the particular inertia of people who had benefited from an arrangement and preferred not to examine it too closely. But that was then. The room felt different from the moment she entered it, and she was too experienced not to feel the difference. The kind of silence that existed in that room at 8:52 a.m. was not the silence of people being professionally discreet. It was the silence of people who had already talked to each other. The board's independent counsel, a woman named Margaret Osei, who had a reputation in corporate law circles for the specific quality of her listening, she gathered information with the patience of someone who had no personal stake in any outcome and infinite time to reach the correct one, called the meeting to order at exactly 9 o'clock. This is an emergency session of the Vanguard Technologies Board of Directors, Osei said, without looking up from the document in front of her. The agenda has been provided to all members. We will proceed in order. First item, the presentation of investigative findings from the Independent Systems Certification Authority. Celeste's lead attorney, a man named Forbes, who charged rates that suggested he was accustomed to winning, leaned forward. Before we begin, the company's legal team would like to formally note our objection to the inclusion of ISCA representatives in this session, on grounds that the investigation's impartiality that objection has been reviewed by this board's independent counsel, Osei said, the same even tone, and has been denied. We will proceed. Forbes sat back. The movement was small. The meaning of it was not. The ISCA's lead investigator was a woman named Taryn Bowles, who had been with the authority for 11 years, and who presented information with a specificity and lack of theater that was, in its own way, more devastating than drama would have been. She did not editorialize. She did not use inflammatory language. She put documents on the screen, actual documents, scanned originals, time-stamped, and she explained what they showed. She started with the authorization records, the federal subcontracting agreement from years prior, the specific language regarding IP ownership, the emergency access protocol. She showed the federal database entry for Rowan's credentials on the day of the lobby incident, active, authorized, emergency flagged. She showed the internal Vanguard surveillance log from 12:19 p.m., the moment the alert generated, and the entry from Thomas Warwick, the head of security, which indicated the alert had been seen and reviewed. The security director reviewed the alert, Bowles said, noted the active federal authorization status, and made no action. She advanced the slide. 14 minutes later, police were called to remove the credential holder from the premises. The room was quiet. One of the board members, an older man named Hargrove, who had been on the board since the company's early days and who had said nothing that morning beyond the minimum required to establish his presence, looked at Celeste Vaughn directly. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you are trying to reconcile the person you thought you knew with information that makes that person unfamiliar. She did not look back at him. Bowles moved to the IP section. This was the longer portion and the more complex, and she walked through it with the same methodical patience. Original contract, original documentation of system development, federal program records showing the development timeline and authorship, and then, on the other side of the ledger, the 3 proprietary filings Vanguard had submitted to the relevant authorities in 2021 and 2022, listing internal development teams as originators of systems that the federal records showed, with specificity, had originated elsewhere. The discrepancy between the federal development records and the company's proprietary filings is not a matter of interpretation, Bowles said. The language is unambiguous in both documents, and the 2 sets of documents cannot both be accurate. Forbes tried again. The filings reflect the company's good faith understanding of Mr. Forbes. Osei's voice was still even. You'll have opportunity to respond after the presentation concludes. Please allow the presentation to conclude. The memos came next, the ones from the private server, processed under the new production order. Bowles put 3 of them on the screen, selected excerpts, redacted in places where the investigation was still active. And the room went through a particular kind of quiet that is different from ordinary silence. It is the quiet of people processing something they cannot unprocess. The memos were internal communications from a period roughly 18 months before the first proprietary filing. They were direct. They were specific. They referenced the federal origin of the systems by description, and they referenced the filing strategy in terms that made the decision-making process clear. One memo, authored by a senior executive who had since departed and was currently cooperating with investigators, used the phrase realignment of attribution in a context that left no genuine ambiguity about what was meant. A board member named Chen, no relation to Iris Chen, a coincidence that the story had no room to care about, put her pen down on the table with a small, precise click and looked at Celeste Vaughn with an expression that was professional and completely cold. "Were you aware of these communications?" Chen said. Celeste's attorney put a hand on her arm. "My client will not be responding to questions during—" "I'm asking the CEO of this company a direct question," Chen said. "In a board meeting, that is within my authority." A beat. Celeste Vaughn looked at Chen. She held the look for 3 seconds. Then she said with a control that cost her visibly, "The company's legal position on those documents is being actively reviewed. That's not what I asked. It's the answer I'm able to give." Hargrove made a sound, not a word, more the sound a person makes when something confirms something they had been trying not to believe. Bowles continued. The financial section was last, and it was the longest. 3 fiscal years of reporting, the forensic accounting analysis, the specific practices that the analysis had identified, revenue recognition methodologies that the accounting team's report described in technical language that translated, in plain terms, to this. The company's publicly reported financial position had not accurately reflected its actual financial position, consistently, across multiple reporting periods. The overseas accounts came up. 3 jurisdictions, the freezing orders, the specific dollar figures, which were now a matter of court record, and therefore part of what Bowles was authorized to present. When the numbers appeared on the screen, there was a sound in the room from the shareholder representatives section, a sharp intake of breath from someone who had clearly not known the magnitude, who had seen the news coverage but had believed, until that number was on a screen in front of them, that there was some version of this where the exposure was manageable. The number was not consistent with manageable. Forbes tried 3 more times during the presentation to interject. Each time, Osei stopped him with the same patient precision. By the 3rd time, he stopped trying. The presentation concluded at 11:47. Bowles gathered her materials with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done their job and knew it. Osei looked around the table. The board will now move to discussion. Company counsel and investigative representatives will remain available but outside the room. The CEO may remain if the board so chooses. Nobody moved to ask Celeste Vaughn to leave. That was its own kind of message, and she received it. What happened in that room over the next 90 minutes, Rowan was not there to witness. He was in his apartment, sitting at his kitchen table, with his phone face up because Walter had told him he would receive a call when the meeting concluded. He had read an article, gotten distracted, read the same paragraph 4 times, and eventually put the article away and just sat with his coffee, which had gone cold, and looked at his phone, which was not ringing. He thought about being in rooms like that one. Not this specific kind of room. A board meeting in a corporate tower was not his world, but rooms where things were decided, where evidence was laid out and people had to look at it directly. He had been in those rooms. He knew what they felt like from the inside. The specific kind of time that passed in them, slower than regular time, with a weight to each minute. He thought about Lily asking if the fox in her book was going to survive. He thought about his daughter's face when he walked into that hospital room. Just the word, Daddy, like he was where he was supposed to be. His phone rang at 1:23 p.m. Walter. "It's done," Walter said. Rowan put his hand flat on the table. "Tell me." "Unanimous vote, 14-0. Walter's voice had that quality again, the compressed, careful thing that lived near gravity. Celeste Vaughn has been removed as CEO of Vanguard Technologies, effective immediately. The board has appointed an interim leadership committee pending a full executive search. All executive authority has been transferred. Rowan said nothing for a moment. The warrants, Walter continued, were executed approximately 20 minutes after the vote. Federal investigators were present in the building. They had been staged with legal authorization in anticipation of this outcome. The charges relate to corporate fraud, obstruction of justice, and securities violations. There may be additional charges as the investigation develops. Where is she now? She's in the building still, to my knowledge, or was, at the time the warrants were executed. A pause. There are reporters outside the building, a significant number. Rowan looked at his kitchen window. The city outside was doing its afternoon things. A bus passing, 2 people on the sidewalk below. A pigeon on the fire escape across the street, attending to important pigeon business. Ordinary city afternoon. "Are you all right?" Walter said. "Yes," Rowan said. And then, because Walter had earned the more complete version, "I don't really know what I'm feeling right now, to be honest." "That's probably appropriate," Walter said. "It's a lot of things at once." "Yeah." "Rowan," Walter paused. "What she said, that day in the lobby, is probably fine. I want you to know that was referenced in the board discussion. Specifically, it was given as an example of the judgment and the attitude that characterized the leadership failure." Another pause. "I thought you should know that." After they hung up, Rowan sat for a while longer. Long enough for the light to shift, and for the pigeon to leave, and for the coffee to reach a temperature that wasn't even worth thinking about anymore. And then, because he was a man who did not know what to do with large feelings, except find somewhere to put them that made sense, he did something that was going to sound anticlimactic, but wasn't. He got up, washed his mug, dried it, and put it back in the cabinet. He needed to pick up Lily. But first, he put on his ironed shirt and got his car keys and drove, not to his mother's house, not directly, but down through the city to the street in front of Vanguard Tower. He didn't go in. He didn't park. He drove slowly past the front of the building and looked at it from behind the windshield. The reporters were there. Walter hadn't exaggerated. There were more of them than he'd expected, a proper crowd now with cameras and microphones and the particular organized chaos of press assembled for something they know matters. They were clustered near the main entrance, and as Rowan drove past, he could see that something was happening at the doors. He almost kept driving. He was almost past the building when he saw her. Celeste Vaughn came through the main lobby doors at 2:41 p.m. She was flanked by 2 members of her legal team, not Forbes, who had apparently left after the board meeting concluded, and there was a federal agent to her right, not touching her, simply present. She was still in the navy suit. Her hair was still pulled back. From the distance and through the car window, she looked the same as she had looked that morning when she arrived, composed, controlled, contained. But she wasn't arriving anymore. She was leaving. The reporters moved toward her immediately, the compact surge of a press crowd that has been waiting and knows the moment has arrived. Cameras up. Questions layering over each other. She did not stop. She did not respond to any question. She kept walking, eyes forward, and her attorneys formed a loose perimeter as she moved through the crowd toward a waiting car. She passed, at some point in that walk, through the approximate area of the lobby where Rowan had stood 5 weeks earlier, where he had put his hands on the security desk and tried to explain about his daughter, where she had stood in front of her investors and said, "Get him out of my building," where the handcuffs had clicked and 60 people had watched him walk toward the exit. She walked through that space now, and the cameras followed her, and the reporters' questions went unanswered, and none of the people on the sidewalk knew to point out the specific geography of the moment, that she was walking through the same lobby, past the same security desk, toward the same exit doors. Rowan knew. He was the only one watching who knew, and he was watching from a moving car, from behind glass, at a distance. He kept driving. He thought, in the 3 blocks after he passed the building, about whether he felt what he was supposed to feel, the satisfaction of it, the completion. He'd been asked, in the weeks since the lobby incident, by Danny and by his attorney, and by Paul Whitaker in the coffee shop, some version of whether he wanted justice or just resolution, whether this was personal or just correct. He had given careful answers each time, calibrated, measured answers. But here, alone in his car with no one to answer to, he let himself be honest for a minute. It was both. Of course it was both. He was not a machine. The woman had put handcuffs on him in front of 60 people while his daughter was having an allergic reaction 20 feet below and had said, "Is probably fine," with the casual certainty of someone who had never had to be afraid of losing anything that mattered. He was human enough to have carried that. But the thing about human feelings he had learned over 32 years of having them was that they did not have to drive the car. You could feel them and put them in the back seat and keep your hands on the wheel and take the right exit. He took the right exit. His mother's house was 20 minutes east. He parked in the driveway and went up the front steps and rang the bell. He had a key, but he always rang the bell, out of the particular respect of a grown child for a parent's private space. And Patricia opened the door with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and a dish towel over her shoulder. She looked at his face. "Is it done?" she said. "Yes." She stepped back to let him in without a word. Lily was at the kitchen table with a book and a glass of orange juice, and she looked up when he came in with the specific alertness of a child who has been waiting without admitting she was waiting. "Hey, Bug," he said. "Hey." She watched him for a second. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." She looked at him for another moment with her mother's eyes in her father's face, the directness that both of them had always had, the inability to be fully convinced by a partial answer, and then apparently decided to accept it. "Grandma said we could make the thing with the cheese for dinner," she said. "The baked thing?" "The baked thing." He pulled out the chair next to hers and sat down. "Okay," he said. "Show me where you are in the book." She turned it so he could see and pointed to a passage near the middle of the page, explaining the plot with the particular intensity of someone who had been alone with a story for too long and needed to tell it to someone. The fox, it turned out, had survived Chapter 4. Chapter 5 had introduced a complication with a neighbor's fence and a missing key that Lily considered both unfair and narratively essential, which she expressed with a hand gesture that was entirely her own. He listened. He let himself listen, fully, without the part of his brain that had been running calculations for 5 weeks, clicking away in the background. He let it go quiet for a while. Patricia appeared in the doorway at some point and looked at the two of them at the table and then went back to the kitchen without saying anything. Rowan stayed for dinner. The baked thing with cheese came out slightly too brown on one side and exactly right on the other, which Lily declared a success and Patricia declared a partial failure, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who held herself to standards she had set decades ago. Rowan ate 2 portions and said nothing about the brown side. After dinner, while Lily was in the living room with her book and Patricia was doing the dishes, Rowan stood at the kitchen counter and finally looked at his phone properly for the first time since the call from Walter. 17 missed messages, news alert, 3 calls from Danny, 1 from Elroy that was probably about next steps. One from Whitaker. A text. Just 3 words. Thank you. Seriously. He put the phone back in his pocket. Danny could wait until tomorrow. Elroy could wait until tomorrow. The news alerts were going to say what they were going to say, and he would deal with that when he had to. He looked out the kitchen window at his mother's backyard. She had a bird feeder out there that she'd bought sometime in the past few years and that she'd placed in a spot that got good afternoon light. It was empty right now, slightly crooked on its post, the seed long since taken. He thought about a slightly crooked birdhouse with sunset colors and a little bit of brown. He thought about what came next, because something always came next. The charges, the legal proceedings, the company's rebuilding, the questions people were going to keep asking him, the process of unwinding what had been built badly and assessing what could be salvaged. He thought about the systems, the ones he had designed, the ones his name was now attached to in the public record whether he wanted it there or not. Those systems had protected 43 million people's data while being fraudulently claimed as someone else's work, and they would continue protecting that data while the legal situation resolved, because good architecture doesn't care about ownership disputes. It just does what it was designed to do. He had designed them to hold. They had held. There was something in that. He didn't know yet what to call it, but it was there. "Are you going to just stand in here all night?" his mother said, appearing at the sink beside him. "Probably not," he said. "She wants you to read to her before bed, the ferret book." "I know. I'll go in a minute." Patricia dried her hands on the dish towel and looked at him sideways, the way she'd been looking at him since he was 7. "You did all right," she said. "I made a phone call," he said. "You made the right phone call, and then you came home and took care of your kid." She put the dish towel on the counter. "That's doing all right." He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure it needed an answer. "Go read to her," Patricia said. "She's going to come in here and get you herself in about 2 minutes if you don't." He went. Lily was already under the blanket on the couch with the book open across her knees, the stuffed rabbit from the hospital, which had apparently made the transition from hospital to grandmother's house with the full authority of an essential object, tucked under her arm. She moved over when she saw him, making room with the efficiency of a child who had been sharing space with a parent her whole life and knew the geometry of it. He sat down. She handed him the book without looking at him, pointing to the top of the right-hand page. He found his place and started to read. The ferret's name was Pip. The girl's name was Marigold. The neighbor's fence and the missing key were more complicated than Lily had described, which was the nature of good complications. He read slowly, the way she liked, doing a slightly different voice for Pip that he had developed over the course of the previous 11 chapters and was now committed to for the duration. Lily listened with her eyes half closed, not asleep. He knew the difference. But in that particular state, children sometimes reached where the story and the real world occupied the same space, and neither was quite distinct from the other. Outside the window, the city was doing its evening things. The lights were coming on in the houses on the street. Somewhere a few blocks away, someone was mowing a lawn at an hour slightly too late for it, the distant hum of it carrying through the suburban quiet. On the 53rd floor of a tower on the other side of the city, the lights were on in a conference room where 14 board members had voted unanimously and would stay on for hours as interim leadership began the particular work of assessing what damage had been done and what could still be saved. In a federal building somewhere downtown, investigators were still processing documents. The memos from the private server, the financial records, the archive of communications that painted a picture of decisions made over years by people who had believed they were beyond consequence. And in a suburb 20 minutes east of the city, in a house that smelled like slightly overbaked cheese and dish soap, a 32-year-old man with a slightly wrinkled shirt sat on a couch reading about a ferret named Pip to a child who had beaten an allergic reaction and still had 4 chapters to go and was not yet asleep. He turned the page. He kept reading. He did not feel like a man who had brought down a billionaire's empire. He felt like a father who had made it home for dinner. The weeks after the board vote moved differently than the weeks before it. Before, time had the quality of pressure, each day carrying the weight of something unresolved, something building toward a point that hadn't arrived yet. After, time became something else. Not lighter exactly, because the aftermath of something large is never light, but different. The way weather feels different after a storm has broken, even when the ground is still wet and the branches are still down, and there is real work ahead to clear what fell. Rowan noticed it first in small ways. He slept through the night 2 days after the board vote, which he hadn't done in 5 weeks. He stopped checking the news twice a day and went to once, and then every couple of days, and then only when something specific came up that Elroy or Walter had told him to watch for. He started finishing his coffee while it was still warm, which sounds like nothing but was, in practice, an indicator he had learned to track in himself. The legal proceedings moved on their own timeline, which was the nature of legal proceedings. Elroy called him once a week with updates delivered in the compact, organized way of a man who understood that his client processed information better in smaller portions. The fraud charges were formal and filed. The securities violations added a second track. A civil action from institutional shareholders was developing separately and would take considerably longer to resolve. The overseas accounts remained frozen pending asset recovery proceedings in 3 jurisdictions, 2 of which were cooperative and 1 of which was being bureaucratically difficult in ways that Elroy described as expected but annoying. Celeste Vaughn had entered a not guilty plea on all counts, which surprised no one who had watched her operate. Her legal team was the kind of expensive that bought time even when it couldn't buy outcomes. And they were doing exactly that, filing motions, challenging evidence procedures, requesting delays, working every procedural lever available. Her bail had been granted at a number that would have been prohibitive for most people, and was not prohibitive for her, so she was out, and she was somewhere in the city, and Rowan occasionally thought about that, about the fact that she was still moving through the same city, breathing the same air, and then put the thought away because it was not productive and was not his business. The company was a different matter. Vanguard Technologies did not collapse the way the early headlines had suggested it might. This was one of those things that the dramatic telling of any story gets wrong because reality is messier and more contingent than a clean narrative wants to be. The company had real employees, over 4,000 of them, and real infrastructure and real client relationships that existed independent of what Celeste Vaughn had done or not done. The interim leadership committee that the board appointed included 2 people Rowan had actually heard of, Marcus Dean, who had a long background in corporate restructuring and the particular temperament of someone who found broken things interesting rather than discouraging, and Helena Vasquez, who had been quietly on the board for 6 years and had, according to Arthur Geary, the shareholder attorney who had called Rowan before the board meeting, been one of the first members to understand what the documents actually meant. Dean called Rowan in the 3rd week after the vote. It was a Tuesday morning. Rowan was dropping Lily at school, standing on the sidewalk outside the entrance and watching her disappear through the doors with her backpack and her purple EpiPen pouch, and a new library book tucked under her arm, when his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Mercer," said the voice on the other end. "My name is Marcus Dean. I'm the interim." "I know who you are," Rowan said. A brief pause, and then something that might have been a small laugh. "All right. Good. I'll skip the introduction." Another pause. "I'm calling because I'd like to meet with you, not for legal reasons. Our attorneys are handling the formal side of things. I'm calling because there are some questions about the systems architecture of this company that I can't get good answers to from people currently inside it. And I've been told, by several people now, that you're the person who can actually explain how things work." "What kinds of questions?" "The kind that start with, what does this system actually do?" and end with, "And why did no one inside the company know that?" Dean's voice had a dryness to it that Rowan found, somewhat against his expectations, reasonable. "I'm trying to understand what we have. What's sound, what's compromised, what's been misrepresented, and what can be fixed. I have engineers who can execute fixes. I don't have anyone who can tell me what the original design intended." Rowan looked at the school entrance where Lily had disappeared. "You understand I'm a potential witness in ongoing legal proceedings. I've cleared this with our legal team and with the ISCA. Walter Fitch's office is aware I'm making this call." A pause. "I'm not asking you to do anything that creates a problem. I'm asking if you'd be willing to sit down and talk through the architecture with our technical team, informally, as a consultant." "I'd want my attorney present." "Absolutely. And I won't discuss anything that's within the scope of the active investigation." "Understood. Agreed." Rowan thought for a moment. The morning was cool and clear, the particular kind of fall morning that made the city look cleaner than it usually did, and a group of kids was filing past him into the school with the chaotic energy of people who had not yet had to think about anything more serious than breakfast. "Send me the details," Rowan said. "I'll talk to my attorney and we'll figure out a time." He met with Dean and Helena Vasquez and 3 members of the company's technical team in a conference room on the 8th floor of Vanguard Tower. Deliberately not the executive floors, Dean had said on the phone, and Rowan had noted the choice without commenting on it. He'd walked through the lobby on the way in. The marble floors were the same. The waterfall feature on the east wall was the same. The security desk was the same desk, with a different young guard behind it, and when Rowan showed his identification, the guard checked the system with the particular alertness of someone who had received specific instructions about this particular visitor, and waved him through without incident. He took the elevator to 8. He did not look up at the floor indicator the way a person who is thinking about a lobby incident would. He looked at the elevator doors, and when they opened, he stepped out and went to the conference room and shook Marcus Dean's hand. Dean was in his mid-50s, heavier than his photographs, with the energy of someone who operated on 4 hours of sleep and considered this a personal achievement. Vasquez was 62 and had a directness that Rowan recognized as the directness of someone who had spent years in rooms where they were not taken seriously and had resolved a long time ago to simply say what was true and let people adjust. The 3 engineers were younger, 30s, all of them, and had the specific look of people who had been working in a company for years and had recently discovered that significant portions of what they believed about their work environment were not accurate, and were now in the uncomfortable position of caring about the work itself while processing what the surrounding circumstances meant. Rowan liked them immediately, which surprised him a little. He spent 4 hours in that room. Elroy was there for the first hour and then had to leave for another commitment, departing with the specific anxiety of an attorney leaving a client in a room full of potential complications, though he'd been reassured twice that the scope was technical only. What Rowan did in those 4 hours was explain. Not the legal situation, not the ownership questions, not the investigation. He explained the architecture, how the systems worked, what the design decisions had been, and why he'd made them, where the load-bearing elements were, the parts you couldn't change without rebuilding from the ground, and where there was room for modification. He explained what the systems were protecting and why the protection had been built the way it had, and he answered every technical question the engineers asked, with the patience of someone who had designed something complex and understood that complexity is not the same as inaccessibility, if you explain it right. Partway through the second hour, one of the engineers, a young woman named Torres, who had said very little up to that point but asked the sharpest questions, said, "Why did you design the emergency access protocol the way you did? The multi-layered verification instead of the simpler single-key system?" "Because single-key systems fail at the worst time," Rowan said. "They're vulnerable to exactly one point of failure, and that point of failure is always the point you couldn't predict. Layered systems are slower and more complicated, and people complain about them until they need them." Torres wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. "If the protocol had been a single-key system," she said carefully, "on the day you tried to access the building, my credentials would have been overridden by the internal reclassification, and I wouldn't have had grounds to challenge it," Rowan said. "The multi-layer system meant the federal authorization was independent of whatever they'd done to the internal record. Both layers existed separately, which is why the alert generated." Torres looked at him for a moment. "You built a system that, without knowing it, would matter to you personally." "I built it right," Rowan said. "That's all." She nodded and looked back at her notebook, and Rowan moved on to the next question, but he noticed that Dean, across the table, had been watching that exchange with the expression of a man filing it somewhere important. After the meeting, Dean walked him to the elevator. Just the 2 of them in the hallway, and Dean had his hands in his pockets and the posture of someone who wants to say something and is deciding how. "I'm going to ask you something you don't have to answer," Dean said. "Okay. Were you offered executive roles after everything came out?" "Yes." "Multiple?" "A few." "And you turned them down?" "Yes." Dean looked at him. "Why?" Rowan thought about how to say it in a way that was honest without being performative about it. "Because I don't want to run a company," he said. "I never did. I like the work I do, I'm good at the work I do, and I have a kid who needs her father to be present and not consumed by something that requires 14-hour days." He paused. "Also, I've seen enough of corporate leadership up close in the last few weeks to feel relatively settled in my life choices." Dean made a sound that was either a cough or a laugh, and then said, "Fair enough." The elevator came. Rowan stepped in, and as the doors began to close, Dean said, "For what it's worth, the people in this company who are still here, the ones who stayed, they know what actually happened. They know what was built and by whom. That matters, even if no one says it directly." The doors closed. Rowan rode down to the lobby. He crossed the marble floor, past the waterfall, past the security desk, and walked out into the fall afternoon, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the outside air. And then he went to get his car from the parking structure and drove home to pick up Lily from his mother's. The IP ownership question was resolved formally 4 months after the board vote, in a federal proceeding that Rowan attended with Elroy and which lasted 3 hours and involved a significant amount of very precise legal language, and ultimately resulted in a ruling that restored the development attribution of the 3 contested system components to the federal program under which they had been created, with licensing arrangements to be negotiated separately. Vanguard Technologies was required to revise all public filings in which the false attribution had appeared, and to issue a formal correction to every regulatory body that had received those filings. Elroy called it a clean outcome. Rowan called it correct, which was different but also true. At some point during those 4 months, Paul Whitaker wrote a long piece, a full-length feature, not a news item, about what had happened. He'd been working on it since the board vote and had called Rowan twice asking for a quote and been declined twice, politely. And on the 3rd call, Rowan had said, "I'll give you 1 sentence on record for the piece. 1 sentence, that's it." Whitaker had taken it. The sentence Rowan gave him was, "I wasn't trying to bring anything down. I was trying to get to my daughter." Whitaker used it as the closing line of the piece. It ran in a major national magazine 4 months after the lobby incident, on a Tuesday, and Rowan read it at his kitchen table on a morning that had become unremarkable in the best way. Coffee that was properly measured, Lily already at school, a quiet apartment, and enough hours in the day to do the work he'd been contracted to do for a municipal utility company that was on its 4th data breach and had finally hired someone serious. The piece was good. He read it once and didn't reread it. He thought Whitaker had handled the material fairly, which was all he had ever hoped for. There were things the piece mentioned that Rowan had not anticipated becoming public, though he understood in retrospect that they were going to. One of them was the nonprofit. He had been thinking about it privately for months, since before the lobby incident, actually, since a conversation he'd had the previous spring with a colleague who ran youth coding programs and complained consistently about the gap between technical training and ethical framework in what the programs taught. The idea had been forming slowly, the way his ideas usually formed, not as inspiration, but as accumulation, one consideration adding to another until the shape of something became clear. He had mentioned it once in passing to Walter Fitch during one of their calls. Walter had apparently mentioned it to someone else. Whitaker had found the thread and included 2 paragraphs about it in the piece, which resulted in Rowan receiving, in the 2 weeks following publication, 43 emails from people who wanted to support the idea, 8 from people who wanted to replicate it in their own cities, 3 from foundations that were interested in funding conversations, and 1 from a retired teacher in Ohio who wrote 3 pages about what she had seen in 40 years of education and what she believed was missing from how technical skills were taught to young people. Rowan read the Ohio teacher's email twice. He printed it and put it in a folder. The nonprofit took another year to properly establish. This is the part of the story that people who like clean narratives tend to skip over because a year of paperwork and board formation and curriculum development and funding applications, and the specific frustrations of building an institution from scratch, does not have the dramatic arc of a board vote or a federal investigation. But it was the work, and Rowan was better suited to work than he was to drama, and so he did it. He called it the Meridian Technical Academy. The name came from Lily, which he hadn't planned. She had been looking at a map one afternoon while he was on a call, and she had said, out of nowhere, "Meridian means the highest point. Did you know that?" And he had filed it without knowing he was filing it, and 3 weeks later, when he needed to name a thing, he opened his mouth and the word was already there. The curriculum took the longest. He had opinions about it, strong ones, and he spent a significant amount of time arguing with educators and engineers and program designers about what belonged in it and what didn't. Arguments that were productive and occasionally heated, and always pointed back to the same central question. What does it mean to build something well? And is well only a technical descriptor, Or does it include something else? His answer was that it included something else. He was not always able to articulate what that something else was in language that satisfied a curriculum committee, but he knew it when he saw it in practice, which is a different kind of knowing and not less valid. The program's first cohort was 22 students. 14 were high schoolers. 8 were young adults in their early 20s who had come through other technical training programs and found them incomplete in ways they couldn't always name. They met 3 evenings a week, and on Saturday mornings, in a rented space in a neighborhood that was not expensive and was not distant from the people Rowan wanted to reach. And the space smelled like the coffee someone always brought, and the dry erase markers that were never fully capped, and the particular human smell of a group of people engaged in something they are taking seriously. Rowan taught 2 of the sessions himself and brought in people he trusted for the others. Iris Chen came in one Saturday and spent 3 hours talking about what she had seen inside a large corporation and what she had done about it, and what she wished she had done sooner, and the room was very quiet in a way that rooms are when something true is being said to people young enough to still be deciding what kind of person they want to be. Torres, the engineer from the Vanguard technical meeting, came in twice. She had left Vanguard 3 months into the restructuring and was now doing independent consulting and had, she told Rowan when she called to volunteer, been thinking about that conversation about single-key systems and why layered systems fail less catastrophically. "You said you built it right," she said. "I've been thinking about what that means, not just technically." "What did you decide?" he said. "That right has to include what happens when things go wrong," she said. "That's the part most people skip. They build for when it works. They don't build for when it fails." "That's a good session," Rowan said. "Will you come teach it?" She did. Celeste Vaughn's trial began 8 months after her initial plea and lasted 6 weeks, during which Rowan was called to testify once, for a day and a half, about the technical architecture of the systems and the federal contractual framework governing their origin. He testified carefully and specifically and was cross-examined by Forbes, who had returned to the case and who spent most of his cross-examination trying to establish that the federal authorization record was ambiguous in ways that it was not ambiguous. Rowan answered every question with the same precision he had always brought to technical matters, and did not get flustered, and did not embellish, and did not give Forbes anything that wasn't exactly what was asked for. Lily asked him that evening what it had been like. He thought about it. "Boring, mostly," he said, and then a few moments that weren't. "Were you scared?" "A little," he said, "at the beginning." She considered this. "But then?" "Then I remembered I was just there to say what I knew," he said, "and I know what I know, so it got easier." She nodded slowly, processing it with the seriousness she brought to information that seemed to her like it had more than one layer. "Is that what you always do?" she said. "When you're scared? Just say what you know?" He looked at her, at the directness of her, the clarity. He thought about a lobby and a phone call and everything that followed from both. "Yeah," he said, "that's basically it." The verdict came on a Thursday. It was always Thursdays in this story, though that was coincidence, or the court calendar, or nothing at all. Guilty on the primary fraud count. Guilty on securities violations. Guilty on obstruction. Not guilty on 2 of the lesser charges, which Elroy described as the jury being careful and Rowan described as the jury being human. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months later. Rowan heard the verdict from Elroy, who called him at 3 in the afternoon while he was at the Meridian space helping a student named Dominic figure out why his code was producing an output that was logically correct but practically useless, which Rowan had been explaining was a category of failure more common and more important than outright errors. He stepped into the hallway to take the call. He listened. He thanked Elroy. He went back into the room. Dominic looked up from his screen. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Rowan said. He sat down next to Dominic again and looked at the code. "The issue is here," he said, pointing. "You solved the problem you were asked to solve, but you didn't think about what the output would actually be used for. So the solution is technically correct and practically wrong." Dominic stared at the screen. "How do you avoid that?" "You ask one more question than you think you need to," Rowan said, "before you build. You ask what this is for. Not just what it needs to do, but what it needs to actually accomplish." He paused. "They're not always the same thing." Dominic wrote that down. The sentencing, when it came, was a number of years that Rowan did not dwell on. He felt, when he heard it, the same thing he had felt at several points in this story. Not satisfaction, not relief, but the particular state of a thing having reached its correct conclusion. Like a system running a process to completion, like a door finally latching after you've been holding it shut. He did not follow the coverage of it closely. He had made a private decision somewhere in the months between the verdict and the sentencing that he was done being a person whom this story was about. He had never wanted to be that person. He had wanted to be a contractor who built things well, and a father who showed up, and eventually the person running a small, serious program that tried to teach young people that technical excellence and ethical clarity were not separate subjects. That was what he wanted. It was a specific, ordinary, entirely achievable set of wants, and he pursued them with the same quiet persistence he had always applied to things he cared about. On a Saturday morning in April, spring finally arriving with the particular stubbornness of seasons that have been delayed and are making up for it, the Meridian Technical Academy held a small ceremony for the completion of its first cohort. Not a graduation exactly. Rowan had resisted that framing because it implied a conclusion, and what he wanted the students to understand was that this was not a conclusion. It was a baseline. 22 students, a rented space with folding chairs and a table with coffee, and a bakery box that someone had brought and that had already been significantly depleted by the time the formal part started. Patricia was there, sitting in the third row with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and her hands in her lap. Danny was there too, in a blazer that was slightly too formal for the occasion, which was Danny. Lily was in the front row. She was 9 now, almost 10. Her birthday was in 6 weeks, and she had a very specific list of requests that she had been refining for 3 months, and which included, inexplicably, a telescope and a particular type of mechanical pencil that she had seen in a video. She was sitting in her chair with her hands folded and the expression of someone attending an important event with appropriate gravity, and when Rowan looked out at the room from where he was standing and saw her face, something in his chest did the particular thing it always did when he looked at her. That wordless recognition of the specific weight of someone who matters completely. He had not prepared a speech. He had prepared notes, which was different, and he looked at them now and then, looked up at the room and decided that the notes were approximately right, but the room deserved something slightly less organized. "I'm not going to tell you that what you learned here is going to make you successful," he said. The room settled. "I don't know if it will. Success is contingent on a lot of things I can't control, and you can't fully control either." He paused. 22 people were watching him, plus Patricia and Danny and Lily and a few others who had come as guests. "What I can tell you is what I think the work is actually for. And I don't mean the technical work. You know what that's for. I mean the reason you put in the hours on things that were hard and didn't work the first time and sometimes didn't work the 5th time." He looked at his notes and then set them aside. "The reason is that the world runs on systems, all of it. The way data moves, the way institutions function, the way information gets stored and accessed and protected. And those systems are built by people, which means the character of the person who builds them ends up inside the system, whether they mean it to or not." He thought about a cybersecurity framework in a building on the other side of the city. He thought about a layered authorization protocol that had generated an alert at 12:19 p.m. on a Tuesday and had, in the producing of that alert, set in motion everything that followed. "Build things right," he said. "Not right because someone's watching, right because the alternative is building something that fails the person who needs it at the moment they need it most. And you won't be there when that happens. You never are. You just have to have made the right decisions before it did." He looked at Lily in the front row. She was watching him with the same expression she'd had in the hospital bed. Steady, clear, just watching. "That's all," he said. "Congratulations. Don't stop asking one more question than you think you need to." People clapped. Someone in the back, he thought it was Dominic, whistled. The woman from Ohio who had written 3 pages and then, 3 months later, shown up in person and enrolled in the volunteer instructor program, clapped with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had been teaching for 40 years and recognized when she heard it something she'd been trying to say. After, while people stood around with coffee and the remaining contents of the bakery box, Lily appeared at his elbow. She had her mechanical pencil, the one he'd bought her early, before the birthday, because she'd needed it for school, and a small notebook she'd started carrying, and she looked at him with her father's face and her mother's eyes. "That was good," she said. Yeah? The part about the character being inside the system. She tilted her head. Is that true? Like actually? Yeah, he said. Actually. She wrote something in her notebook. He didn't ask what. He had learned that the things Lily wrote down were for her own reasons, and that asking sometimes closed a door that was more useful open. Danny appeared, bakery box in hand. There's one left, he said, holding it out. Chocolate. I've been guarding it. For who? For you. Danny pushed the box toward him. You did something good here, man. This is real. Rowan took the last piece from the box. It was one of those dense chocolate things with a slightly uneven glaze, the kind a bakery puts out that isn't their showpiece item, but is actually better than the showpiece. He ate it standing in the middle of the room with people talking around him and the spring light coming through the windows, and his mother across the room explaining something to one of the students with the animated authority of a woman who has been retired for 4 years and missed having people who were required to listen to her. He thought about the fact that 5 months ago he had been in a police station with handcuff marks on his wrists and cold coffee in a paper cup, making one phone call. He thought about all the things that Call had set in motion: the investigation, the documents, the board vote, the trial, the rebuilding, the attribution restored, the foundation returned to the people it belonged to. He thought about Iris Chen sitting in that rented space on a Saturday morning telling 22 young people what she wished she had done sooner, about Torres teaching a session on building for failure, about Dominic learning the difference between a technically correct solution and a practically useful one. He thought about 43 million people whose data was protected by systems that now bore his name in the official record alongside the federal program that had commissioned them, because the truth had been established, and it turned out the truth was fairly durable once you let it actually stand. And he thought about none of that too, because the room was full of people, and the coffee was decent, and Lily was writing something in her notebook, and Patricia had moved on to a second student who seemed equally helpless to exit the conversation. And none of the large things were present in this room except as the invisible architecture underneath the ordinary things. That was, he thought, probably how it was supposed to work. You built the thing. You built it right. You made sure it held. And then the holding happened quietly, in the background, while the ordinary life went on above it. The coffee and the bakery boxes and the 9-year-olds with mechanical pencils, the siblings in 2 formal blazers, the retired teachers who drove from Ohio because they believed something was worth showing up for. You didn't have to be in every room where it mattered. You just had to have done the work before it did. He crumpled the bakery box and tossed it cleanly into the recycling bin across the room. Not a difficult throw, just a throw that happened to go where it was aimed, and turned back to the room, and his daughter looked up from her notebook and said, "Nice." "Thank you," he said. "Can we get actual lunch after this? The good kind." "What's the good kind today?" She considered. "Soup dumplings." Done. She went back to her notebook. He went back to his room full of people, and the spring light kept coming through the windows, and the city outside went about its Saturday with the complete indifference of cities toward the particular human events occurring inside any given building on any given block. Which was fine, Rowan thought. Which was exactly fine. Not every important thing needed an audience. Some of the most important things happened in rooms that weren't even trying to be noticed, between people who just showed up and did what needed doing and then went and got soup dumplings after. That was the whole story. That was all of it. A man tried to reach his daughter. He was stopped by someone who had forgotten, or perhaps never learned, that power is not the same thing as being right. And then the truth, patient, documented, indifferent to urgency, did what truth does when it is properly cared for. It held.